This book was written by Scott Lobdell, and Lobdell is not a good writer. Lobdell decides to make a character who's basically the same, except worse in every aspect. But hey, maybe there's hope. DC announced a new book starring Wally, something I've been asking for since my Why Wally Matters video. I mean, he was a big part of this story. Maybe they can just retcon this whole thing and get back to telling good Wally West stories. Maybe DC is finally starting to care about Wally West. Okay, now let's see who's writing this thing. Shit. Book's actually pretty good. The last line of dialogue we hear from Wally West before Flash Forward is bros before heroes, as he fist bumps the man he just framed for murder before getting kneed in the balls by Harley Quinn because he was responsible for the murder, mutilation, and defiling of dozens of heroes and an innocent family. So, things were looking pretty bleak for Wally West. Not only were his actions reprehensible, they were also completely out of character. Wally is in the biggest hole of all time. He has no family, and he just killed off any remaining friends he had. How is he gonna get out of this one? Flash Forward comes in with the premise, this is dumb. There were many different ways to handle Wally's future after crowning him as the premier serial killer in the DC universe, many of which probably involved a deep dive into Wally's psyche as he slowly puts the pieces of his life back together, or perhaps changes his life for the worse out of denial or fear. But Flash Forward has no such interests. As the title suggests, the story is about Flash moving forward with his life, not staying still and taking the time to address his current state, or worse, move backwards as a disproved rumor suggested that Wally would team up among DC's worst villains as a member of the Suicide Squad. Flash Forward moves through Wally's story with its head turned and hand covering the events of Heroes in Crisis. It wants to forget its own past like DC wanted you to forget the Justice Society, but this time, it's actually for the best. Now, tossing Wally back into the role of hero so abruptly without any time to heal or contemplate his actions will certainly lead to intolerable mental stress for Wally. But if that's the price we have to pay to getting him back on track, I say go for it. Flash Forward is simple superhero action, which I will gladly take any day over 12D character assassination, and the story starts like any good Flash story, by throwing as many Flash references at you as possible. It's honestly impressive how easy it is to please Flash fans, and don't get me wrong, I am one of them, but all you have to do is pack your story with enough Flash facts and I'm probably gonna like it, which I guess makes sense for a hero who owns his own museum full of references and artifacts. Take Flash War, for example. It's not my favorite story arc in existence, but hey, that's Commander Cold. They're talking about Wally and his family. That's Zoom. The Flash is like a Kevin Smith movie, where cameos can easily make up for an average plot. So in Flash Forward, we get right out of the gate with references to Double Down, Girder, Murmur, Tar Pit, none of which actually contribute to the story, but I'm damn glad they're there. And this hint at Flash continuity shows us that this is going to be a story that puts the Flash in the right direction, forward. The story follows Wally as he's guided on a journey by recently created Metron stand-in Tempest Fuginon to save neighboring worlds from the plague of the Dark Multiverse. And unlike several recent Wally appearances, Flash Forward heals Wally West by having him interact with others. This book features an array of all-star team-ups including partnerships with President Superman, Roy Harper, and a version of Wally's wife from an alternate dimension. Just like Homer's Odyssey, Flash Forward is a story about returning home. For Odysseus, this was physically traveling back to Ithaca after the Trojan War was over. But for Wally, this was returning to a proper state of mind after believing he could never be a hero again. But both Wally and Odysseus commit to their journey to finally return to their family. After however many years, Wally is finally reunited with his kids Jay and Iris in this story. Things are starting to look up for Wally West. He almost has his kids again. He almost reunites with Linda. He's almost a hero again. But let's focus on that almost. If Flash Forward set Wally up on a forward path to reunite with his family, the ending swerved Wally off into an alternate path that he'll surely stay lost on for a while. The story ends with Wally fusing with the Mobius chair and Dr. Manhattan's willpower to become something, quote, even greater than Wally West. So even though Wally or Dr. West or Dr. Flash Hatton or Moby West or Walter Manhattan or whatever Wally's going by brought his kids back, he's found some other excuse to avoid being with them. And it is at this point that I realize that Wally West has made no story progress since he was brought back in DC Rebirth. When he was brought back in DC Rebirth Special Number 1, he had a plan to use his newfound continuity knowledge to restore the DC universe to its former glory by finding his family and fixing the timeline. And now, 5 years later with the new powers of Mobius, he has a plan to use his newfound continuity knowledge to restore the DC universe to its former glory by finding his family and fixing the timeline. Wally is yet to succeed at every goal he set out to achieve since his return. And it's absurd that by the end of Flash Forward, we're still at the same point we were 5 whole years ago. So now Wally takes up his role as the grand observer of the DC universe. Just like Metron, his job is to watch from outside of time and stay the fuck away from any meaningful story interaction. But really, that's been Wally's job since day one of Rebirth. He wasn't given his own solo series, his character hasn't remained consistent. Instead, a flicker of some dude who vaguely resembles Wally West shows up every now and then to remind you that he's still alive. But it's not like he's richly engaging with the characters around him, he just pops in to remind everyone that he's still trying to rescue his kids, which I'm sure he'll accomplish at some point. If any DC character stopped and actually asked Wally to show his work on his rescue crusade, they would just laugh at how little he has accomplished. Just like now that he's fused with the Mobius chair, just like how he was trapped in the Speed Force, Wally's sole purpose is to observe his friends as they go on to develop into meaningful characters. But that doesn't make sense. How is Wally an outsider? I mean, he was brought back in DC Rebirth. So what happened? You see, Wally was never reborn in DC Rebirth. He was resurrected, and the two mean very different things. A phoenix is reborn, for example. Every time it dies, it rises again from its ashes without the memories or experiences of its past lives. To be reborn is to start wholly anew, with the potential to grow into a completely different person with new circumstances and experiences. But resurrection is what Jesus was famous for in the Bible. He resurrected Lazarus, meaning he brought him back from the dead as if he were the same person. Lazarus was brought back from the point at which he died, not starting over again. Or for a comic example, the creatively named Lazarus Pits that resurrect Ra's al Ghul whenever he dies. But why does this difference matter? Well, it fucking doesn't. I mean, this is all just bullshit nitpicking about superheroes. But once you accept that, one could say it's important that Wally West is properly resurrected instead of reborn. When you're reborn, you're often completely unrecognizable from your previous life. Take the New 52, for example, which is ironically more of an actual rebirth than DC Rebirth was. Here, all of the characters' origins are changed. They're still the same characters with the same potential, but their different experiences create different characters. For example, it turns out if you kill Superman's parents, he grows up to be a far less interesting character. Or Billy Batson is an even better example. He's still a fun-loving kid, but growing up in the foster care system made Billy more jaded and irresponsible. So one of the negatives of rebirthing our characters is that they fundamentally change into something we're unfamiliar with. But there's also the downside of having to repeat the same tired story. Every time a character is reborn, we have to go through their whole origin story again. And I, for one, am a little sick of the recent boom of superhero origins. It's retelling the same material. I want to see characters move forward instead of looping back around to each character's origin every time I pick up one of their books. What DC Rebirth was a resurrection. It brought back things from the original universe still intact. It let these concepts continue instead of sending them back to square one. The most literal example of this is Superman from the Lois and Clark series, who is just pre-Flashpoint Superman with no strings attached. This is important because now Superman has all of the legacy and experiences of his past life. This is actually progress instead of retreading the same ground. So when Wally returns from the Speed Force in DC Rebirth Special Number 1, he is resurrected, he is not reborn. And that seems like a good thing. I don't want a brand new de-aged Wally. I don't want to watch Wally in every story go, Captain Cold. Never heard of him. But Wally's return is a false resurrection. For he has briefly returned and then promptly began to get the fuck out of the way of any important DC story. It's like a necromancer class in any popular video game where they summon a fleshbag minion for a few seconds before it dies or returns back to Earth. Even though this is pre-Flashpoint Wally West, what progress as a character has he made since returning? I mentioned that Flash Forward moves him forward, but that's only because he was moved backwards so much. So his net progress is still in the gutter. Wally was never actually resurrected. He didn't pick off from where he left off like Lazarus in the Bible. Instead, he's still picking up the pieces from his previous life, trying to assemble himself back together. All that's changed since his return is that now we get to watch him make no progress in the background instead of it just being implied. But even if they didn't successfully bring back Wally in DC Rebirth, why did they need to bring him back? What went so colossally wrong that DC needed to save Wally West in the first place? In 2009, Jeff Johns released The Flash Rebirth, bringing Barry Allen back to the DC universe after his death in Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. And this story was an actual rebirth for Barry Allen in a different way, imbuing Barry with an entirely new personality. Now, in this first 6-issue miniseries, Barry remains pretty similar to his original interpretation, but that would eventually fade. Barry Allen was reborn as a more palatable Wally West stand-in. You see, ever since his inception, Barry Allen was an unlikable scumbag. But why do people keep reading his comics then? Well, because his powers are really fucking cool. In fact, Barry had no real personality. Instead, each of his character traits were just things that would help you if you were a guy who ran really fast. His knowledge of science and chemicals helped him better understand his powers, but it didn't make for a more fleshed out character. He and every other hero in this era were some Aryan super scientist from one of Kennedy's wet dreams, with the goal of guiding children on the path to becoming a scientist to defeat the commies, brilliantly disguised as Flash Facts. And bow tie wearing, home by 9 Barry Allen was the soulless Coca-Cola ad poster child for this complacent, do-gooding army of American superhumans. He ran fast because if you slowed down to actually follow a day in Barry Allen's life, you would be bored to death. Like the executives must have thought, well, what qualities should our new hero have? Well, he should be heroic and save people. So just as the stories focused on Barry's life as a speedster, so too did Barry as he blatantly ignored all of his personal responsibilities. Every other issue, his love interest Iris would declare to never see him again until 3 pages later when she and Barry are 10 minutes into yet another romantic date before Barry sneaks away to solve another caper as the Flash. In this abusive Stockholm Syndrome relationship, Barry would attempt some increasingly outlandish, borderline illegal act to win Iris back. Like here when Iris leaves him a note saying she's tired of being stood up. So Barry, this degenerate scum, steals the weapons from his villains instead of turning them into the police to subliminally put his image in front of Iris until she breaks down and decides for one last date, which Barry is also late to. Now, of course, Iris finally breaks up with Barry, until 2 issues from now when he and Iris are back together, which in the meantime, we can only imply Barry stole some other villain's weapon to siphon Iris's will to live. This man needs to be stopped. That's not to say Wally also didn't start off as a fairly bland character as he spouts his catchphrase, "Jumpin' Jets!" more often than Barry gleefully ditches Iris. But Wally eventually grew out of this phase, while Barry did not. And because Barry just wasn't as interesting as Wally, when he was reborn in Flash Rebirth, he was made to resemble Wally as closely as possible. In fact, it's gone so far that Barry and Wally have now completely switched roles in the DC universe. Let me explain. Here is Wally at the end of The Return of Barry Allen, where he finally accepts his place in the Flash legacy. He uses Barry as an aspiration for becoming a hero and honors his legacy as the Flash, while still realizing that he himself is the Flash as he finally comes into his own. Barry was used as the sentimental mentor that Wally looked up to, and Wally was the one who needed to wear the mantle of the Flash right now and saved those who needed saving. But now, it's the exact opposite. Because just like Thawne returning from the past to steal Barry Allen's place in The Return of Barry Allen has returned to steal Wally West's place in The Flash Rebirth. Except Barry Allen didn't get his brain fried and shipped to an alternate timeline. Throughout the past 10 years, there has been a masterstroke plan at DC to condemn Wally to the same horrible fate of Barry Allen after his death on Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, this is not the fault of anyone at DC at all. It would be out of line to blame this on any actual human being. This is just a bunch of coincidences between writing, editing, publishing, and marketing that have led to the ultimate demise of Wally West. But the plan is so good that it would be a shame not to attribute it to some evil cabal of masterminds dedicated to the destruction of Wally West. So for fun, let's call this anti-Wally group the Legion of Dumbasses. And ever since Barry returned in Flash Rebirth, the Legion of Dumbasses decided to give Barry Wally's personality, with a few marketable twists. Well, the public really likes Batman, so let's give Barry basically Batman's origin. And we have to make it seem like Barry was important the whole time, so let's make him the creator of the Speed Force. The Legion then pushed this character into as much media as possible. Barry was the poster boy for the Flash TV show, the Justice League movie, and every important DC event throughout the next several years. Now, as far as the public was concerned, Barry Allen was the Flash. So when Wally returned in DC Rebirth, Barry still had all of the spotlight. The Legion then chopped up Wally's appearances to a few different titles so that Wally still didn't even feel like he was there enough, though he was returned to the DC universe. And with that, the Legion of Dumbasses succeeded at completely switching the roles of Barry Allen and Wally West. Let's look at the current arc in the main Flash book, The Flash Age. Here the new villain Paradox attacks Barry, stating he's not as good as his legacy counterparts of Jay and Wally. Here Barry finally accepts his place in the Flash legacy. He uses Wally as his aspiration for becoming a hero and honors his legacy as the Flash, while still realizing that he himself is the Flash as he finally comes into his own. Genius, isn't it? And Paradox, wow, is he sure something. I think some 90s comic writers started possessing the artists at DC to come up with all these bulky, unmemorable meat slabs of villains. You're telling me that Paradox and Rogolzar aren't the same character? Fucking hate Rogolzar. Anyway, I'm sure at least 500 to 600 people can claim copyright infringement on this Doomsday's left nut looking ass because his whole character is that he's a Wally West stan. We're at a point where Wally West fans are now the villain in Flash stories. And Paradox's dialogue could basically just come from a Reddit commenter. So let's play a quick game of, is this something I said, or is it seriously an actual fucking Paradox quote? The rules are simple. I'm going to pop up a few quotes on the screen, and you have to tell me whether they are things that I said or things that Paradox actually says in the comic. Here we go. Our first quote. He's not the first Flash, and he's far from the last, but he is the one who is written about the most. The one who shapes the legacy of the Flash. Why is he the worthy one? Paradox or me? Well, let's cut to the issue. Here Paradox rambles on about what makes Barry special, and the answer by the end of the story is probably that he inspires hope or something, because that's one of Barry's character traits now. So yeah, that's an actual quote from an actual villain in an actually approved, published, and distributed Flash comic. Alright, next up. Flashpoint was one of the worst mistakes in the DC universe. This one, I made up, but he comes pretty close, talking about how Flashpoint alone ruined the timeline. But you see what I mean. This is something I would say, and it's something Paradox would say. Kinda ridiculous if you think about it. Alright, what do we got next? What good has he done since his return that is greater than his death? Paradox? Or me? Well, let's cut to the issue. The correct answer is fucking nothing, but he actually says it in this issue, which is just impressive. Way to go, Paradox. I'm sure they won't forget about you after the story and never use you again. Alright, how about, you know what I think? He should have stayed dead. Paradox or me? Well, let's cut to the issue. Yeah, he should have stayed dead. Way to go, Paradox. I've said this in my videos before, but Paradox also says this, so right on, Paradox, you tell him. Alright, and finally, Barry Allen is a way less interesting character than Wally West, and his presence is preventing new, interesting Wally stories from being told. This one was me. How did you guess? But it could totally be something Paradox says. The guys arguing for Wally West are now literally the villains of the Flash story. But it didn't have to be this way. Wally and Barry could happily coexist. And for a brief period, they did. Let's cut to DC Rebirth. Here is the beautiful, moving return of Wally West in DC Rebirth, where Barry Allen mentions, "How could I ever forget you?" Well, unlike Barry, DC can do a pretty fucking good job of forgetting Wally. Here we see the true resurrection of Wally West. He has returned, and unlike Barry Allen, his personality has not been overhauled. This is genuinely the fun-loving character we've known and loved for ages. As we see here in the first arc of the Titan series, featuring the return of the roster from Wolfman and Perez's New Teen Titans. And not only is this Wally the same character, he's from the pre-New 52 continuity. So when he touches Nightwing and the other Titans in this first issue, they remember their lost pasts. In this arc, while nothing special, is a genuine Wally West story. Here he and the Titans face off against Abracadabra, who actually forces Wally to make decisions and develop character. Wally makes an apparent sacrifice because he loves his teammates, and he eventually comes back to life because he realizes he doesn't just need his family, but he also needs his friends. But as the Titans book continued to dissolve, Wally kinda disappeared. He sat on the outskirts of DC with fans wondering when writers were going to continue his story. So to understand how little progress Wally has made since his return, let's take a look at his goals and conflict. Wally's goal at the beginning of DC Rebirth is twofold: to investigate the being that stole 10 years from the universe, and to reunite with his former girlfriend Linda Park. Wally doesn't do too much about the whole 10 years storyline, as that role gets mainly passed off to Barry and Bruce. So Wally's goal is then to reunite with Linda Park. At some point he discovers he has kids and lumps their rescue into the goal of getting back with Linda. So in order to achieve Wally's goal of restoring his family, what conflict does he face? Dr. Manhattan took Wally's family away from him, but what's stopping Wally from putting it back together? Well, the problem is that the conflict that Wally West faced since the beginning of DC Rebirth isn't internal or external, it's editorial. Wally didn't return and say, "Hey guys, glad to be back. Let's continue telling stories where I fight criminals and do traditional Flash-related things." Instead, his goal was to reunite with his family. So he's not really moving forward with his life, he's trying to resurrect the areas of his life that are now missing. So Wally's story is to bring back the rest of the pieces that allow you to tell Wally West stories. This is not bringing all of Wally back and continuing his story, this is bringing part of Wally back while we go and watch him get the rest. So what conflicting forces stop Wally from reuniting with Linda? Well, he just doesn't know how to. This Linda doesn't know who Wally is, but she's also from another universe. So would it even make sense for Wally and her to get together? And what's stopping Wally from reuniting with his kids? Well, first off, he doesn't even know that they exist. It's not until Editorial, aka Zoom, shows up and reminds Wally that his kids exist that he can start making progress to finding them. And this is 3 years after Rebirth started. Wally came back completely unequipped to solve any of the problems he set out to face. So he's just left pondering where oh where his family could be. So after his brief reintroduction in Titans, where does Wally show up? Let's take a look at the stories he's involved in after Titans, which should give you a scope of how monumentally fucked Wally West is. Not only do some of these stories net no positive development, but most of these stories aren't even fundamentally Wally West stories. Let's start with Flash War, a story where Wally is the villain for the majority of the story, and this arc introduces Wally's goal of saving his kids. Even though he hasn't even gotten close to getting back together with Linda, now he has to go save his kids from the Speed Force. Like the conveyor belt scene from I Love Lucy, Wally is given problems at a faster rate than he can solve them. Hey, welcome back, Wally. But no one remembers you. Also, your kids are dead. Also, your wife doesn't love you. Also, your nemesis is back. Also, I would say give the guy a break, but he converts to villainy faster in this story than Luthor converts to Perpetua. His arch nemesis tells him he has to go save his kids. Now, I'm not a father. I'm sure Wally's going through a lot. I don't even blame him for trying to save them. But that doesn't excuse Wally flipping out for no reason. Like here when Barry tries to help him, so Wally responds, "If you stop me from running, I'll make sure you never run again." What the fuck, Wally? But he gets over it and ends the story by going to hunt down Zoom. Yet another objective he has to complete. But he's not gonna do that. Because Wally in Crisis, no. Heroes in Wally, no. Heroes out of character, no. Heroes in Crisis. And even though this is the next big appearance of Wally West, this is certainly not a Wally West story. It is a story where Wally is the antagonist. Let me just make that clear. In the first 2 stories following Wally's departure from the Titans, Wally West is the villain. Heroes in Crisis is not the next step in his story, nor is it a story that deals with him at all. It's just a story that happens to have him as the killer. And then there's Flash Forward, the story where he is guided along by Tempest Fusionuts just like he was guided by Zoom in Flash War. Sure, Wally makes decisions here and is in character, but this is DC digging a character out of a hole opposed to taking him in a new, meaningful direction. And even though Wally is returning to his regular temperament, Wally's journey to return to normalcy excludes any of the normal elements of a Wally West story. Not only is Wally not his fun-loving and quippy self, but we're not in Keystone City, we're not battling the Rogues, and we're certainly not returning to Wally's family at the end of the story. So between Flash War, Heroes in Crisis, and Flash Forward, what all has actually changed for Wally West? He's basically the antagonist in 2 of those stories, and the third is just about pretending that he isn't. Have we moved Wally further along since he returned in DC Rebirth? No. But even if Wally didn't make much progress in finding his children, it couldn't get that worse. Right? So let's get back into the clusterfuck that is Heroes in Crisis. Here is the problem with Heroes in Crisis. No, here is one problem with Heroes in Crisis. Before going into the story, Wally had a clear arc: reunite with his family. Each story before this event continued this plot, albeit slowly. But Heroes in Crisis gives Wally an entirely new conflict before his last conflict is even solved. On the surface, it might seem like Wally being sad over the absence of his children is a natural next step in his quest to find them. But it's just not at all. First off, Wally's inner struggle was never this intense throughout DC Rebirth. I guess this panel just takes place somewhere in between Wally lovingly hugging his friends for supporting him and his newfound determination to save his family. I guess Brett Booth didn't get the memo and accidentally showed Wally smiling and having fun like his character is fucking supposed to, because Wally's hyperbolized guilt in the series has no relation to the events leading up to the story. But more importantly, this is a completely different conflict. In Heroes in Crisis, Wally is no longer struggling to find his kids, but is now struggling to deal with his sadness over their absence. His conflict went from external to internal, and this completely derails what little momentum the story had going forward. Before he can continue looking for his family, he now has to deal with his sadness. But if at the end of the book, he gets a good night's rest at Sanctuary, they send him on his way, then that's only like 9 issues of meandering filler. But because heroes have to be in crisis, now Wally has to deal with the trauma of murdering dozens of heroes too. He's slammed between a prison cell and now can't do anything about finding his family. So Wally's progress at the start of DC Rebirth is already behind where it should be because he doesn't have his family and supporting cast yet. And even though each story moved forward incredibly slowly, at least the direction it moved was forward. Heroes in Crisis moves Wally's progress way the fuck back. This is why I'm happy with how Flash Forward handled the whole Crisis situation. Instead of dedicating the whole book to Wally recovering from his mental problems, Wally recovers from his mental problems while also on a quest for his kids. That doesn't mean that Wally's trauma is completely ignored in this book. The whole reason he goes on this quest is because his sadness inadvertently created a world in the dark multiverse that is consuming the rest of the worlds in the multiverse. So in a weird way, Tempest Fugifuck is a better therapist than that robotic sanctuary that encouraged patients to eat high-powered laser shots ever was. But all that Flash Forward is a band-aid. It half commits between exploring what little potential there is of making Wally a killer and forgetting that the whole thing happened. So it feels like we're reading Lobdell's instructions of how to untie a knot or something. It's impressive how, by the end of Flash Forward, even though he's found his kids, he's still not even finished completing the goal he set out to at the start of DC Rebirth. But there is one character that also returned in Rebirth that basically has the same arc as Wally West. Except, it's done well.
Oh, I'm not like the Flash at all. Some would say I'm the...
Eobard Thawne makes zero fucking sense. This man died when Barry Allen snapped his neck. He also died when Thomas Wayne shoved a sword through his heart. He's also died a total of 7 times and is still alive. But just like Wally coming back to life in DC Rebirth, Thawne returned as well, because even though he's a walking paradox, fans still love him. Just like Wally West, Eobard Thawne was completely rewritten in the New 52. Instead of being a Flash-obsessed fan who traveled back in time to learn he was destined to become the Flash's greatest foe, Thawne was turned into a dictator from the future, who despised the fact that people worshipped the legacy of the Flash, but hated him, so he traveled back in time to destroy the Flash's reputation. Now while this is far less interesting than his original motivation, at least he didn't get turned into a racial stereotype like Wally West. But DC Rebirth did not care about this new, uninspired version of Professor Zoom, and in the Doomsday Clock prelude, The Button, writers King and Williamson returned the original Eobard Thawne. In the very first issue of his return, Thawne clearly states, "I have been resurrected." And he's exactly right. This is the Thawne from before the New 52, returned in all of his glory. But unlike Wally's return, Thawne's resurrection was done right. Both Wally and Eobard returned at the start of DC Rebirth, and each of their arcs were to restore the history of the pre-Flashpoint universe, considering no one else in the DCU had a clue as to what was going on. But if Wally and Thawne were both hired for the task of bringing back their continuity of the DCU, Thawne would be promoted, and Wally would be fired immediately and then taken out back in shot. So here's Wally's arc. Reunite with Linda, find out about his kids, meet with his wife from an alternate timeline, finally meet his kids, and it's still ongoing. Here is Thawne's arc since his return. I am going to snap Iris's neck. Boom! It's that simple. Thawne and Wally have the same story arc of making the present like the past. But like a proper speedster, Thawne actually does it quickly. He briefly appears in Doomsday Clock to pay back Bruce for killing him in Flashpoint, before dying again because he does that. But within the very next issue of The Flash, he's back at it again, ready to kill Iris and make Barry's life a living hell. He actually drives change forward for Barry. In his Rebirth Flash debut, not to be confused with his Flash Rebirth debut because nothing about the Flash universe is confusing, Thawne reintroduces the negative Speed Force, reveals Barry's secret identity to Iris, and cements himself as Barry's #1 antagonist. So while Reverse Flash rushes into Barry's life and forces him to change for the better, here's Wally stumbling around trying to figure out that Manhattan refers to Dr. Manhattan and not the city. This is where pacing plays a key part in proper storytelling. Thawne's return had momentum, because it continually forced change and created new reveals. But Wally returned promising new information and then promptly crawled back into the loneliest forgotten corner of the DC universe. Because Thawne returned as a whole without the 10-year task of restoring his family, Flash writer Josh Williamson is actually able to tell new Reverse Flash stories. If you look at his latest appearance in the Flash Age, we get to see Thawne team up with Barry Allen. And because the two know each other's histories, it makes for a great dynamic. Here, Thawne has actually made progress forward since his return. There are new and exciting Reverse Flash stories that don't center around Thawne picking up pieces from his old life. But even though Wally's story is fucked, there's gotta be some way to fix things. So how do we fix this whole situation? Simple, we give Wally a proper resurrection. We don't just spawn him off for a few stories and then cast him off to become a serial murderer. I mean, let's look at the entirety of Wally's arc from Rebirth to Flash Forward. Wally wants to reunite with Linda. Wally learns that he has kids. Wally can't rescue those kids and inadvertently gives a supervillain godlike power. Wally has to go off and find Hunter's element. Wally decides not to do that. Wally slaughters dozens of heroes. Wally gets locked up. Wally finally gets back with his kids. Wally has to fuck off in the Mobius chair. Since Wally has returned 5 years ago, he hasn't even accomplished the one goal he set out to complete. And although I'm happy Wally got his kids back, I wouldn't be surprised if it's just another tease before Wally has to bludgeon his kids' kneecaps and feed their souls to a demon for the good of the multiverse or some shit. Because not only can't Wally be happy, we can't be happy for Wally. Wally's one goal is to bring back the aspects of Wally West that fundamentally make him work. I want to see him back in Keystone interacting with his citizens and fans. I want to see Wally battling his old rogues and encountering new ones. I want to see Jay and Iris grow up and learn from their father. I want to see anything that faintly resembles a story about Wally West. Because between Titans, Flash War, Heroes in Crisis, and Flash Forward, Wally has yet to set up the pieces of his life that allow him to become the Flash again. While Barry darts around Central City having the time of his life, Wally is scrambling around the DC universe trying to figure out what the fuck to do. And I appreciate that Flash Forward is getting Wally back in touch with the standard superheroics that you'd expect. We see connections to his home city of Keystone and his rogues. We see him actually inspiring others and saving the multiverse, but it's just a stepping stone and not a fully realized return of Wally West. It's been 11 years since Wally has been the front and center of the Flash universe. It turns out Dr. Manhattan stole 15 years from Wally West, the 10 from before the New 52, and the 5 in Rebirth he spent doing fuck all. It's time for all of Wally's pain and suffering to be rewarded. All of these stories that promise the return to form of Wally West focus on the past with promise for the future. But they don't bridge the past and the future. They don't return Wally in the present to his former glory. So the way to fix Wally is to tell stories where Wally is truly the Flash. Barry and Wally can happily coexist in the same period. But Wally's been so busy in Sanctuary and other universes that people forget he's still a Flash. DC touts that it would be interesting for Wally to go through depression, or interesting if Wally fused with the Mobius chair. But do you know what's really interesting? Wally West. We don't need to keep extending his story like this. I don't want Wally to turn into a character with only parts of himself intact. I don't want Wally to become more than Wally West. I just want him to be Wally West. So I don't want a reboot. I don't want a rebirth. I want Wally West to resurrect the DC universe to what it was before the New 52. The battle with Dr. Manhattan is over. The mystery of Rebirth is solved. As Wally puts it in the DC Rebirth special, I look down at it and I know without question that I love this world. But there's something missing. But little did Wally know, that thing was Wally West. Because even though the Flash is moving forward, he needs to pick up the fucking pace. Hey guys, don't forget to like, share, please don't unsubscribe. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at InfinityIncom1 if you want. Let me know how you feel about the Flash Forward in the comments below. And I'll see you guys next time.